What if the sky itself learned your name and whispered it back in colors no human throat could make? What if a light in the far north turned toward you like an eye, and every snowflake carried a memory you were not meant to keep? Some stories are too strange to be true, but what if they became true the moment you heard them, and the only escape was to pretend you believe in nothing at all? Welcome back to Whispering Abyss. Tonight, I brought Alaska to your door. Wind that bites like a secret kept too long. Boards that pop in the cold because something is pushing from underneath. From eerie voices in the spruce to footsteps that do not sink in fresh powder. Every story here is a slow, key turning in a locked room you thought was empty. Lean in. Keep the lights low. If you have ever felt watched by the northern lights, you know the feeling I mean. Which story creeped you out the most? Tell us in the comments, so I know what to bring you next time. Story 1. The last light at Barrow Station. The last light at Barrow Station never went out. It was taken. I learned that on the 73rd night of the long dark, when the corridor bulb didn't just flicker, it breathed. It swelled like a chest, dimmed like a sigh, and something under the floor answered with a scrape that felt conversational. If you have ever watched a light behave like a living thing, you know you start listening to it like a pet, like a clock, like a throat clearing before it speaks. I told myself it was the ballast failing. I lied for warmth, not truth. My job was simple. Keep the emergency beacon live, log every anomaly, reset the timer every 12 hours so medevac flights could find us through the fog. The beacon is a promise you make to the sky. Lose it and the sky forgets you. I stayed because the bonus would clear a debt and my mother needed heat back home. Dan, the day tech, said the place wasn't haunted, only neglected. The sea ice groaned at night. The wind put its fingers in the siding. We both pretended we believed him, but he slept with his boots on. Inside air should be dry, but our breath fogged even with the heaters humming. You could see your words in front of you like little ghosts. That is the first thing I noticed. The second was the snow. Every morning, no tracks. Smooth as poured milk. The wind could do that, sure, but even the snow around the door looked ironed. The third was the lights. Not a normal flicker. A pulse. A pulse that sometimes matched my heart and sometimes did not. I learned the feel of the station's attention, like a dog that is not your dog. The first night the radio spoke my name, it came tucked inside static, the way a memory hides inside a scent. R's and K's are hard to fake in white noise, but there they were, shy and accurate. I froze with the mic under my thumb and heard another sound, a long drag of something rough on wood beneath my boots. We didn't have crawl spaces, just a service void. I tried to laugh. Then I opened the logbook to write it down and found numbers in the margin that I did not write. Not times, tallies. Quiet and patient. Dan saw the numbers in the morning and squinted. He liked to play skeptic even when his coffee shook. He said I probably counted something and forgot. He said the radio was skipping from sunspot activity. He said the lights were ballast. He flipped the breakers in the corridor and the pulsing bulb stayed on, which he pretended not to notice. The door sensor showed an opening at 3:07, but the outside camera was a white sheet. The snow at dawn had no footprint, not mine, not anyone's. If Dan was pranking me, he had an accomplice named Weather. 4 hours before my scheduled reset, the beacon monitor chirped and the load dropped like a heartbeat mist. The corridor bulb swelled twice and held. In stations like ours, a beep can feel like a scream. I made the rounds, tools belt slapping my thigh, and the scraping traveled with me under the floor, keeping pace like a polite shadow. In the power room, the oscillograph drew a shape I could not name, a rhythmic trough that looked like a sleeping thing rolling over. I told the logbook I was investigating. In the margin, another neat mark appeared by itself. I lifted the generator panel and watched the needle bounce at exact intervals with the corridor light. When the bulb brightened, the station seemed to inhale. When it dimmed, something under the floor exhaled, and frost formed along the seam of the hatch like a smile, trying to freeze. The door's sensor blinked. The panel chimed. The outside alarm clicked to green and back, as if someone paced the threshold and erased their own passing. I checked the camera again. Empty world. The radio hissed and said my name, slow, like it was tasting the syllables to see if they were ripe. I reset the beacon anyway. The rule says never delay the sky. The instant my finger hit the switch, the scraping surged a long drag that ended in a wet, cold shudder through the floor. My breath turned to fog in a room warm enough for shirt sleeves. The corridor bulb steadied, as if a decision had been made for both of us. The monitor went solid green, a comforting lie. From the mic, static took on cadence, and the cadence made words again. It did not say my name. It said do not. It said stop. It said I know the smell of you. I called Noah for a diagnostic and got nothing but a chorus of thin voices stacked on static. An old lullaby leaked through, nonsense syllables my mother used when the oil ran low and the stove ticked like a bomb. You can call me gullible, but you can't convince me the wind remembers lyrics. I checked the server for a cache file. No playback. No hidden folder. The corridor bulb winked like it thought it was getting away with something. Whatever lived in the static knew my house, my kitchen, my mother's voice. At my back, the floor answered with nails. Dan pretended not to hear the song, which is its own kind of hearing. He took a long time to pick up his coffee and an even longer time to swallow. The cam feeds were all white except for the one over the beacon mast, which held one frame of the mast leaning like a man. He told me the ballooning light meant power fluctuation and nothing else. He told me to get some sleep before the storm rolled in. I told him the bulb matched my breath. He told me to stop listening to my lungs. We both lost that argument. Next shift, I found frost footprints inside the corridor, not on the floor, but in the air, a constellation of crystal where knees would be if someone crawled. The snow outside remained perfect. The hatch to the void was crusted with rime in finger shapes. I opened it and felt a low heat like a hand on my face. You never expect warmth from the wrong place. The light above me flattened to a dull coin, and the warmth moved away, a polite retreat, which was somehow worse. I called out like an idiot, and something answered with a single hopeful scrape. The countdown to the next reset ran on the screen like a small animal in a wheel. 47 minutes. Storm 220. The beacon mast had a manual crank that hadn't been used in a decade. I had the inside controls and the backup sequence, and I could keep my boots dry. So I told myself, you know that voice you use to sell yourself a cheaper fear. The radio crackled, then softened like cloth. It said open the door. It used a voice I trusted more than my own. It used mine, but younger, scared of the dark and dead. Comms went thin. Satellite hiccuped. The generator coughed, a phlegm sound that would have made Dan swear if he were there. I isolated circuits to keep the beacon fed. Kill heat to the bunk room. Kill power to the mess. Keep light for the corridor and the mass control. The station dropped 10 degrees in 2 minutes. Our breath turned to smoke and then to ice ferns on the glass. Cutting the heat saved us power and cost me mercy. I did anyway. The immediate consequence was a rattle in the walls. The delayed echo would be the lock freezing later. Dan was gone. His parka hung by the door like a person without a neck. His boots lay under the bench, soles dusted with salt he had never walked through. I pressed the intercom and got a soft sleep sound that could have been a snore or a recording of one. The e-ink panel by the door said open 307 in thin letters, and below that, nothing. The camera gave me blank snow and a sky the color of old milk. The radio whispered, let me in, and the corridor bulb wished on and off like it meant to keep a secret. If this were a gas leak, the CO monitor would sing. It read clean. If this were stress, the numbers in the margin would not keep appearing in a hand neater than mine. On the bench sat a folded note with my name, and the letters had the cramped look of writing done in a hurry with gloves on. It said it wants the light. It said do not reset unless you feed it. The signature said Dan, except Dan wrote his N's like M's, and this signature wrote them like hills. The paper was too cold to have been held by a human hand. The radio breathed like a sleeping mouth pressed to the mic. The words came careful. Not your watts, your warmth. It was the first time it gave me a fact and not a threat. I watched the corridor bulb rise and fall and realized it was not tracking power. It was tracking me, bright with inhale, dull with exhale, and brighter when I ran. Every time I touched metal, frost found me. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I am telling you because once you hear it, you will notice when your lights listen, and you will listen back. 12 minutes to reset. The storm knocked once at the siding and then settled in, like a neighbor you cannot refuse. I had two choices: kill the beacon before it killed me, or go out and hand crank the mast to bypass the hungry current and give the sky what it wanted without feeding the floor. Inside, I could delay and argue and try to be clever. Outside, I would be alone with a crank that might shear in the cold and locks that might freeze behind me. I put on my parka. Choice is just a story you tell yourself about fate. The door stuck, then let go with a patient sigh, like it had been holding itself shut for my own good. The dark outside was complete, except for the Aurora lifting like curtains with someone behind them. The wind carried small pieces of glass that used to be snow. The ground had that dead quiet you get when everything is watching. I clipped to the safety line and felt it twitch like a live wire. Under the snow, a low scrape kept pace with me, then paused when I paused. I try not to imagine something huge crawling in a cold tunnel. The mast looked taller from the ground, a metal bone with a joint that had not moved in 10 years. I wedged my mitten in the crank and pushed. The radio on my shoulder woke and sang the lullaby again, but this time the singer got the melody wrong on purpose, like someone trying to convince me she was my mother, not checking her sheet music. My breath fogged and rolled toward the mast, not up and away. The corridor light shone through a window behind me, and I could feel it touch my back like an eye. Tom makes a sound. I cranked. The beacon coughed into a steady tone. The station lights went wild, not broken, jubilant, a chaos that had rules I could not read. The snow around the mast bulged like a chest, then flattened. The same bulge rose near the door, then flattened. Imagine something swimming just under the top of a lake. Now replace water with snow. That is what I saw, and that is why the mornings were so neat. It was erasing me. It had been erasing us every night, smoothing its own wake. The bulb in the corridor brightened, delighted, and my hands went numb. It came close without being seen. I felt it as subtraction. Where it hovered, heat bent toward it like grass to a mower. My breath fanned sideways. Frost grew toward it in tidy spines. The scraping finally stopped, not because it left, but because it arrived. I had two choices, both vicious. Keep cranking and let it drink whatever the beacon asked of me, or cut my own path for the current. I dropped the crank and jammed the ground wire against my wrist, skin to copper, stupid and simple. The cold went through me into the wire with greedy grace. The light steadied. The corridor bulb stopped its animal pulse and became a simple machine. Across the yard, the Aurora folded in, as if a face had leaned close to the window of the sky. My fingers went dead to the second knuckle. The thing inside the snow pulled harder and then protested in a sound I felt more than heard, a refusal like a child told no. The numbers in the logbook were not times. They were hours of someone's warmth bought and sold. Ben had paid some of mine in advance. The presence was not killing the light. It was feeding it. When the pull ended, it ended clean like a thread snipped. The ground wire smoked in the scentless way cold metal smokes. The beacon hummed like a prayer you do not believe, but still say. Immediate consequence, my hands were wrong. Delayed echo. I will discover in spring that my fingerprints do not belong to me anymore. The snow under my boots sank an inch and then rose back up like an apology. From the open hatch of the void, I heard a voice like Dan's whisper. Not from the radio, from the wood, from the screws, from the slow thaw. The door had frozen while I saved us. I smashed a side window with the crank handle and dragged myself through, parka catching and tearing on a screw head that smiled with frost. Inside, the warmth returned in stretches, like a power outage finding rooms it forgot. I looked at the logbook, and the numbers stood in neat columns that marched to the edge of the paper and then right onto the table like ants. I scratched a mark through them, like you cross a tally of days. The pencil moved by itself to add one more. I let it. I owed. I found Dan under the service hatch, not in it. He had pulled the panel and then lost the courage to go through, or the panel had closed and then lost the courage to let him back. His face was pale in a way that looked thoughtful, not dead. He took my wrist and hissed when he felt the heat there. It took a long time for him to say a sentence. When he did, the station listened. "It liked you better." Then he closed his eyes, and the corridor light warmed to a blush. If you have ever been chosen, you know the bruise. I made the final reset with minutes to spare. My voice on the emergency log sounded like an actor in a commercial for calm. I chose my words like they might hold the station together. The recording ends with the scrape under the floor, drawing a question mark I can still feel in my feet. The log file is corrupted in a way our software engineer will call poetic when he reads it in spring. There's a place where I say it took warmth, not light, and then the file turns to a bright band of pure tone. Then silence. I must have slept, because I woke to a sound of clean silence that only comes when the storm has left and taken its opinion with it. The world outside was a fresh sheet again. Not a single dent where I fell by the window. Not a scuff where my boots slid. Not a trace of Dan's hands on the hatch. In the bunk room, a perfect circle of frost crowned the ceiling above my pillow, as if something had rested its head there while I dreamed. The circle did not melt when I breathed on it. It moved a little like a coin on water. We kept the beacon. The planes found us. The storm ended like storms do, with a sudden failure of anger and a long, light rain of old snow. Dan went home early and never sent a card. My hands lied to biometrics now, and the station doesn't recognize me until I cough, which the camera understands better than my face. At night, the corridor bulb is steady except once, just before the 12-hour mark, when it brightens and dims in the shape of another person's breath. I pretend not to hear the scrape that follows, polite and hopeful and patient. If you ever work a night shift where the lights learn your name, remember this. There's a hunger that lives in useful things. A lighthouse is a mouth if you stand close enough. A heater is a hand that takes what it gives. Numbers and margins are not always math. Sometimes they are tally marks on your warmth. I add to mine when the station asks. I do it because the sky needs a promise to find you. I do it because that is what I was chosen for. I do it because that last light never goes out. It only moves closer. The final image is simple. A calm corridor. A single bulb. 2 breaths, not 1. The second breath belongs to the floor. It waits for me to reset the clock. It will wait for you if you listen hard enough. When I stop, the number in the margin will not. The snow will smooth everything. The beacon will cut one perfect circle from a dark. The rest of the dark will lean in to learn my name again. If you think this cannot be true, you will sleep better until your hallway light takes a slow, grateful inhale and then stops pretending. Story 2. Footsteps on the Iditarod Trail. Now, we move to the second story. On the Iditarod Trail, your dog should be the only ones making tracks, but mine weren't. The first time I noticed, the wind had finally died and the woods held their breath like an audience. It was just me, 10 dogs, a sled full of gear, and a ribbon of snow that ran between spruce and birch like a road nobody had paid taxes on. Then I saw them, neat as stitched seams, a second set of paw prints loping alongside the team where no animal ran. They kept perfect pace, then faded when I looked like a guilty smile. You learn the different voices of snow when you live on it. The dry scritch of fresh powder, the sticky pull of wet sugar, the crisp 2-note of hard-packed trail under runner. That day, the sound that kept teasing me was boot crunch just behind the sled, 8 or 9 paces back. If you have ever heard a footstep that did not belong to you, you know how your shoulders crawl with a heat that makes no sense in that cold. I called out, expecting a friendly musher or a ranger. Only the timber answered, ticking as it shed ice. There was a clock in all this. Checkpoint by nightfall, or you risk more than a scolding. You risk the dog's rest plan falling apart, and then nothing you do adds back up. I tapped my watch face, scratched with frost, and counted the hours left. Plenty, if the trail behaved. The dogs leaned into their collars like they were pulling me out of debt and into spring. I whispered thank you to Togiak, my lead, because you never stop thanking the thing between you and losing your toes. He flicked his ears back like he heard something I hadn't, then whined. That's when I heard the bell. A faint ring, thin and far. Not the cowbell you get at finish lines or the proud clatter of team, where's its ceremonial starts. This was delicate, a runner's bell, the kind old-timers tie to a single leather strap, so you can hear your lead dog when the light goes weird. Except I hadn't tied any bells today. No team around me had, either, not according to the last checkpoint chatter. The ring came in pairs, like a heartbeat that wanted to be friendly, and then it stopped when I spoke my own name to the trees. The trail bent left around a stand of spruce, then opened into a meadow where storms love to practice. A dozen trees on the low side wore old carvings on their bark, names of mushers who had passed in summer's cutting trail. Most were scarred over. A few were fresh enough the sap looked like tears. I read a couple I knew from stories. Men who vanished on a whiteout year when the flags blew down. Someone had tried to gouge them out with a knife and given up. My glove traced the shallow grooves and found a new mark below them, half finished. It was my first initial in a crooked line that might have turned into a name if the cold hadn't closed my hand. I told myself some bored volunteer had started a joke and thought better of it. I told myself a lot of things the way you do when the easy explanation resents being used. Togiak surged, and my second in line, Kiska, threw a look over her shoulder as if to say don't linger. The bell chimed again, closer this time, as if agreeing. 50 seconds later, a glow leaked through the storm like a lantern cupped by a careful hand, just up the ridge. Lanterns on the trail aren't unusual. Volunteers use them when headlamps die and generators sulk, but they usually swing with a person's stride, and this one hung very still, as if a hook had found a point in the snow and the light wanted to stay put. It burned a color I couldn't name at first. Not warm, not cold, something like moonlight put through old glass. "Hey there," I called, cheerful in a way that fooled no one, least of all me. "That you, Ranger Tom?" The glow leaned left without moving, as if listening for a better answer, as if it could. The dog slowed without a word from me. 10 animals from different villages and different tempers, suddenly moving like one muscle, all of them weighing the same idea. They didn't fear the light, exactly. They fear my interest in it. If you know dogs, you know that look. Bravery, translated into something close to pleading. I made the responsible choice. Keep to the markers, ignore the glow, focus on the clock. I made it for about 30 yards. Then the bell rang twice, clear as a toy in a quiet church, and the extra paw prints reappeared beside us, keeping a beautiful, wrong rhythm. I dipped my headlamp and saw the prints better. They weren't dog pads. They suggested toes, but not boot lugs, an impression like a hand walking on its knuckles. The stride length matched Togiak's Lopez, always exactly even, but occasionally skipping 3 in a neat patter as if the maker liked to hop. No Nodarak, no smir. The prints appeared, then frosted over even as I watched, like breath on glass. I wanted to tell myself it was drifting snow filling from below. I wanted to, and then the footsteps on the right side of the sled finally crossed behind me to the left. That is not supposed to happen if you are alone. You can't pace yourself from 2 sides. Unless there are 2 of you. The bell chimed once from a meadow and once from behind, and too far apart to belong to any one thing. The dogs flinched like someone had thrown a shadow at their faces. I dropped the snow hook to let them rest without sliding and scanned the tree line for headlamps. Nothing. The lantern winked out, then returned 50 yards farther along a faint cut through the spruce that wasn't on my map. The luminous color it shed pooled instead of spilled, like fog. I opened the little pocket where my race radio lived and whispered my bib number. Static answered like a stream, scraping its own bed. If anyone was near, I didn't want to talk, or they wanted to listen. Over the wash of white noise came syllables soft and wrong. My name, but said with the wrong mouth. It made the vowels flat where they should have rounded. It put the stress on the wrong part. If you have ever heard someone try your name and miss, you know the intimate awkwardness of it. How it sounds like a hand on your shoulder that isn't there. I told myself the bell and the lantern belonged to a safety patrol. I told myself the extra prints were a wolf doubling my path and catching my drift from behind. I told myself the carvings on the trees were trail humor. I told myself a dozen small, true-sounding lies, because the big truth was impolite. The clock in my chest said, keep moving or lose the night. The actual clock said 4 hours and a bad stretch of river ice ahead, and storm flags that like to lie down where the trail bends. I pulled the snow hook and told the team to go on. We ran. The lantern slid ahead of us through the spruce in no hurry, always just far enough to be a guide, never close enough to be a person. The bell taught itself to be louder, and it began to ring on the left while the prince showed on the right. I tried to reconcile. Maybe 2 volunteers. Maybe a checkpoint crew moving back to camp. Maybe I could ask them to run interference on the worst of the drifts and we'd make up time. I try to want that. The trail blinked, and when it opened again, I was no longer on the main cut. We spilled onto the river, the way you do when you're following a shortcut that only sort of exists. The ice had a rim of powder and a heart of black glass. Perfect for speed, perfect for swallowing you if your luck soured. The dogs found the center line by habit and ran quieter, as if the river liked to listen. The lantern paused at the far bend, a small sun in a bowl, waiting. The bell came from behind me now, and the footsteps sounded different on the ice, more complicated. It was no longer crunch. It was tap and slide and faint knocking beneath. Footfalls under ice are not a sound you forget. They move like seals at first, then like a lizard you once saw on a nature show, skittering. I swallowed hard enough to taste metal and eased us toward the bank, where snow covers the murderous shine. The extra paw prints reappeared on the powder like etiquette notes. 3 steps parallel, 1 crossing behind, 3 more parallel. Playful, almost if you like that sort of game. The bell chimed in time with my heart, and for the first time I felt the bell choose the tempo and my heart obey, which I did not admire. On a wind bank curve, driftwood lay in a puzzled pile, bones of trees the river had eaten and then returned. Someone had carved names into the gray flesh, practiced strokes from board hands. But these weren't old. The edges were clean, frost blooming around each gouge. I found the vanished year, the one the elders lower their voices to mention. Under it, a list of last names people still wear at the fish plant and on mailboxes. And under those, a single name not finished yet, but close. The first letter matched the one on the spruce earlier. The second was mine. I didn't stop to see if the third would follow. I told myself a volunteer with my sense of humor had run out of daylight. I told myself to keep the team moving, keep them warm, keep the line tight, keep breath out of the fur where it turns to ice and cuts. Kiska's right rear booty had spun and come off somewhere back of the meadow. She favored her pad, a small hitch that is louder than a scream to people who listen. I threw the hook and dropped to my knees in the snow and wrapped her foot with my spare scarf, cursing gently. We lost 7 minutes to that kindness. I would lose an hour rather than see pain go unaddressed, but the clock still ate my gut in small bites. The bell faded while I worked, then came back louder once I rose. It felt like approval. The lantern bled its color into the air over the far bank, then darted behind a cut of willow like a child hiding. The willow made a kind of corridor in the snow, inviting and wrong, a hallway where nothing lived. The flags that should have marched down the river's edge had wandered off to gossip with the wind. The trail rewrote itself, the way people rewrite their past in the retelling. Gentle edits, then bigger ones. A familiar bend became unfamiliar. A known channel became narrow where it used to widen. The dogs lined out beautifully, trusting me to name the world. I named the lantern safety. I named the bell guidance. I named the carvings prank. I ran in the names I had chosen like a man running in borrowed boots, blisters blooming where I pretended they didn't. The corridor of willow ended in a shine of ice the river hadn't shown me last year. It looked thin. It looked eager. We hesitated. It's a word that fits dogs and men, just in different ways. I felt the sled's weight want to drift, the runners wanting a simpler truth than the one my eyes offered. The lantern moved to the right, as if to say, cross here, all good, shortcut. The bell rang in a pattern I recognized, though it took me a beat to place it. It was the old checkpoint chime for all clear, the one we retired when someone lost a clapper in a storm. Who's there? I shouted, grateful for once to be the one asking a cliche. The ice breathed. I looked at the lantern again and saw the detail that broke the spell. The flame had no center. Real fire has a heart. This looked like a memory of light someone had pinned to the air. The glow didn't get weaker at the edges either. It kept its ferocity right up to its skin, if light can be said to have skin, and I do think it can when you're asking it for favors. I turned off my headlamp and looked. The lantern did not change. It didn't flare with the absence of competition. It just was a red herring, I thought, offering itself like a helpful lie. I brought the lamp back and checked the willow. Low, interlaced, pretty to look at, and nasty to move through if you were a moose. The corridor narrowed in a way that would trap the sled if we entered and the wind shifted behind us. I pictured a shy person with a flashlight luring us in, and then a quick drop as hidden overflow took the lead's feet. You can call that superstitious. I call it the shape of the thought my body offered me. The bell kept the all-clear beat. The footsteps from behind came faster, then stopped like they were holding their breath. I had to choose, and choices have to remove something to count. Follow the lantern and keep the race alive, or abandon the shortcut and the race to hold on to something more important than applause. I looked at my dog's feet lined up like good soldiers. I looked at the willow throat ahead. I felt the ice under the snow do a trick I hate, a tiny settling like a recalcitrant chair. I pulled the snow hook and veered left, off the pretty corridor, onto the ugly wind-blown shelf where the world looks like it hates you. I told the dogs we were done racing for tonight. Immediate consequence. The sled's weight took the shelf badly, and we tilted, everything in the bag migrating like a small town. I fell, knees and hands, and pride meeting hardpack with a smack that made the bell go quiet, as if even it winced. The lantern drifted back toward the river, offended in an oddly human way. I let the expensive gram-saving pot roll into a drift and didn't fetch it. I cut the spare line that always gets in the way when you tip and watched it snake away like I had let go of more than rope. When I stood, I was on a different night. The willow corridor collapsed behind us. Not physically, but in the way a story collapses when you choose a different path through it. Where the lantern had hung was now an ordinary shadow. The bell came from above, which bells shouldn't. It rang from the crown of a black spruce up on the bank, then from the next, as if someone was walking along the canopy, ringing it with a stick. We moved under the trees into a section of trail that looked older than a map. The bark carvings returned, and now they crowded each other like signatures on a petition everyone regretted. Names I knew, names I had heard whispered with winter in the mouth, names I'd seen on old posters at the post office. Winter takes, and people soften the edges of how, but the tally here didn't care about poetry. Deep gouges, some with dates, some with little stamps I took for symbols, until I realized they were notches matching bell rings. I looked for the thing my fear demanded and found it. A fresh gouge with the angle of my first letter already pressed into the cambium. The knife marks weren't falling flakes of sap. They were a slow, patient carving no hand held. I told myself a prank line again and disliked how thin it had gotten. The bell above became impatient and rang 3 times. Small temper tantrum in the tree. The dogs stared at me with expressions humans ruin when they try to draw them. Trust, heavy as a blanket you aren't sure you deserve. The footsteps returned to the snow behind us, and I could tell by the spacing that they were close enough now to touch the sled if they wanted. They chose not to. Something about politeness made that worse. Polite monsters keep their appetites in their pocket until you smile first. The radio woke, and underneath the static I heard the checkpoint manager's voice, tinny and bored, reading arrivals. A few names, times that made sense. Then a name that was mine, a time that was impossible. Yesterday, just after dawn. The record of an arrival I hadn't lived yet. Copy, I said, and hate for the need in my own voice burned my throat. The voice repeated the list. The lantern bloomed ahead again in a patch of trees I knew for a fact did not belong this close to the river. The footsteps circled to the left and became the creak of snowshoes. If you have ever tried to convince the world it is wrong about you, you understand the fatigue that took my knees. This wasn't about my dogs, I realized then. The thing loping beside us didn't want them. It wanted me tied to the trail the way names tie to trees. The bell hadn't been guiding my team. It had been practicing saying my name without my permission. The extra paw prints were the habits of a thing that learned to walk watching dogs, like a stalker practicing someone else's handwriting. The lantern was an invitation to get off the official story and into its book. "Not today," I said, and drew my knife. I wasn't stupid enough to fight snow with steel. The knife was for the harness. I cut the spare tug on Togiak's line, the one I kept out of sentiment for a friend's old setup. Useless weight I always talked myself into carrying. It had to mean something to the trail that I gave up the last vanity. It had to. The immediate consequence was quick and ugly. The sled lurched as the tension shifted, and the rear runner shot hard into a stump and shaved wood like a barber. The delayed echo would hide until morning. I like to say the lantern flinched. Light doesn't flinch. It just turned down a notch, as if a hand had cupped it, the way people do when they want you to trust their control. The footsteps behind us backed up, testing the new geometry of want. The bell, petulant now, rang out a different pattern when I recognized too late. Not all clear. Lost team. The sound they use when they want everyone to stop and look. Only, nobody else was near. The trail wanted me to stop and look. The trees creaked like elders trying not to laugh at a funeral. We climbed a low rise and found the old trapper's line locals had warned me about, a disused cut where the wind likes to throw its tantrums. The night had polished it into glass and left it lit by Aurora that came and went like someone playing curtains. On the far side stood a cottonwood scarred white from lightning, its bark a ruin of handwriting. The names there weren't neat anymore. They had scratched themselves to the edge of legibility. High among them, a space had been left bare, a courtesy. A right-sized rectangle for my last name, the letters knowing where they would sit. The bell quieted. The footsteps stopped. The lantern drifted close, now no more than 3 body lengths away, close enough to feel it as temperature rather than light. Cold has flavors, and this one tasted like old coins. "You don't want the dogs," I said, speaking to what you will tell me is wind. "You want the story that comes when the manager reads my name." The lights swelled as if in approval. I tried the radio again and heard my name in that wrong mouth, past tense, already filed. I put the knife away and took out the race number from my parka pocket. It's a silly thing, Tyvek and hope, but it's what the trail reads when it becomes official. I held it out to the lantern like a passport, which is stupid if you think about it and necessary if you don't. "Take this instead," I said. "Say I scratched. Say I withdrew. Take all the time you were saving to put me on that tree and give it to a rookie who still believes in coffee." The lantern dimmed to a thoughtful grain. The bell stayed quiet. The footsteps had the dignity not to shuffle. For a second the world considered mercy and found it plausible. Then the knife work began anyway, not in my hand. In the tree. The blade that wasn't a blade carved the first 2 letters of my name with the delicacy of a signature on a contract. The wood gave with damp little squeals. Sap beaded like tears. My number in my hand felt like nothing compared to that neat, ruinous act. I did the one thing I could think of that changed shape instead of begging. I stepped to the tree and carved a different line below where mine was starting. I carved finish. Then I cut a shallow arrow back toward the proper trail. The knife snapped at the hilt like a joke told too hard. I had enough to mark the arrow, not enough to ruin the letters already there. The lantern flared once, angry without moving, a sun held in a fist. The bell fell from the high branch that had no bell and hit the snow so softly you guessed rather than heard. That was the only sound it ever made in the right place. We stared at each other, me and the listening world, and for a span I can't defend with numbers, I felt the trail decide whether to eat my dogs first out of spite for my courage. It didn't. Togiak broke the spell the way leaders must. He leaned, low and patient, into his collar, and Kiska followed, and then the whole line moved like a rope pulled by a boat, and I stumbled to keep up because it was probably crying, and because I had said the right wrong thing at the right wrong time. We left the carvings tree with my half-name hanging there like a torn tag on a new coat. The lantern followed for a stretch, then fell back as if the air had thickened. The footsteps kept pace, but never touched the sled again. We made the checkpoint with minutes to spare before night decided it owned all corners. The dogs shook and sneezed and ate like gods. I signed a volunteer's clipboard with a hand I was embarrassed to watch. The manager, big parka, tired eyes, smiled like people smile at survivors. "Good time," he said, glancing at a printout. "You were through here yesterday morning." He said it like paperwork, not a horror. I laughed, the terrible polite laugh a man does when he cannot afford the real noise. "Must be a glitch," I said, and he nodded because we both like glitches better than alternatives. I went to the wall where they pinned the run logs. There was my name, tidy and dull, slotted into a row a day early. The bell on the nail by the door, the one kids ring for fun when a team departs, glinted a familiar way, and for a second I smelled old leather and fox urine, the scent of a kennel that no longer exists. Someone had carved a little arrow into the corkboard below my row, pointing back out the door, the same shape I had cut in the cottonwood. I looked at the volunteer. He didn't see it. They rarely do until stories tell them. I slept with my boots near, which is not advice so much as confession. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of footfalls on dry snow outside the tent. Not dogs, not boots, something with the discipline to stop at the edge of patience. The lantern did not glow through the canvas. The bell did not ring. I lay there and listened to a thing consider me, count me, put away my possibility like a tool it might use later. Morning snow was clean because it always is when the trail wants to be believed, and I let it. If you race long enough, you learn that some losses are additions. I lost the finish I'd wanted for the story I wanted later. I gained the dog's trust in a way you can't buy with meat or praise. I also gained an echo. When I left that checkpoint, a volunteer handed me a folded scrap of paper someone had dropped. It held a single letter cut from a magazine, my first letter, and a second cut raggedly from the edge of a photograph, as if someone had run out of patience with neatness in the cold. I kept it. You keep what listens to you. When you watch frozen trees at night, you see riding the wind, didn't put there. When you hear a small bell in an empty forest, you're never the only listener. When you see a lantern, test its heart. Real flames have one. Borrowed light is all skin. As for extra paw prints, I don't try to explain those to people anymore. It wants names, not dogs, and it wants them while you can still hear yourself answer if someone says yours wrong. If you hear a bell ring in all clear where there should be none, you run on the trail that hates you. It hates you because it knows your taste. The last thing I'll tell you is a kindness to the part of you that thinks paperwork can save us. Months later, a friend at a village office sent me a photo of a shipment slip they couldn't reconcile. It showed dog food delivered to the checkpoint warehouse a day before I reached that section of trail. The signature was mine, a good forgery or a perfect one, depending on your appetite for belief. I don't sign like that. My actual scrawl is a confession I never finished college. The one on the slip looked like someone trying to become me by neatness. If you ever find a cottonwood with my first 2 letters of generation deep into its bark, leave it alone. And if you must carve anything, make it an arrow pointing back to the proper trail. It listens that trick, not because the trail respects your bravery, but because it loves rules even more than fear. It wants the story to add up. It wants the list to be tidy. That is the most frightening thing if you let it be. Not the hunger itself, the accounting, the way it makes room for you before it knows if you're coming. You might ask why I'm telling you this in the first place. Because some stories want to be carried on foot, and this one isn't finished until someone hears the bell and chooses against it. If you do, let me know how your name sounds when the wind tries it on and misses. If you don't, someone will read your arrival before you build it with your steps, and the trail will smile without a mouth, and a lantern will be the only thing that remembers you well. Story 3. The Aurora that looked back. Now we move to the third story. The Aurora does not just move. It notices who is watching. I learned that on a ridge outside Talkeetna, where the spruce lean like listeners and the snow is so clean it looks like uncut paper. I went there to work, not to dream. 3 cameras, 2 tripods, fresh batteries nested in wool, a compass I wore like a superstition, and a thermos that smelled like burnt sugar. If you have ever stood under a sky that rearranges itself while you breathe, you know the feeling I stepped into. Curiosity with teeth, waiting to bite. The first odd thing was small enough to dismiss. My wide lens frosted on the inside the moment I snapped the cap off, a ring of hoarfrost forming from the glass inward, like an iris that wanted to see more than I did. The second was the color. Greens and violets bent where they shouldn't, not in curtains, but in arcs, as if someone had drawn circles with a compass and the sky obeyed. The third was the hum, so low I felt in my teeth. I told myself it was the highway far below, though the highway had gone to sleep hours ago. A local named Jay had sold me bait store coffee and a sermon. After 2:13, he said, "The lights get full. You do not want them full of you. People in small towns are in strange lines. Usually they spend them carefully." He handed me a cheap magnetic compass for free. "If it starts chasing its tail, you pack up," he said, "and you do not argue." I laughed because I am not brave enough to be polite. The compass sat on my glove, well-behaved and needle on a leash. My phone clock said 1:21. Plenty of time for art or trouble. I set the time lapse. 30 seconds between shots. ISO high enough to encourage color without poisoning the blacks. The first sequence looked like a postcard for a better life. Snow smooth as icing, stars nailed to the roof, a pole of green ribboning across the river's bruise. Then the camera glitched. Every fourth exposure wore a scar. A thin horizontal streak, bright and curved, with a darker bead at one end. It looked like a pupil caught mid-blink. I reran the frames. The scar blinked in sequence, slowly closing. My breath fogged the live view, and the frost ring grew a millimeter inward, patient and precise. The wind climbed a ridge in syllables. I heard the kind of whisper you get from dry snow rubbing spruce-needled skin. The shape of it tugged at my ear. 2 vowels, then my name. Not shouted, not even said, just misremembered out loud. If you have ever heard your name from an empty room, you know the way your spine tries to be a thermometer. The compass on my glove shivered, and the needle twitched toward nothing. My shadow stretched across the snow at a strange angle, not toward the town's low glow and not away from the moon. It bent from the Aurora. There's a rational explanation for almost everything until you need it to be. Sensor banding. Cosmic ray strike on the sensor. Compression artifact. Old lens element breathing in the cold and exhaling crystals. I cycled batteries because batteries are cowardly in the cold, and told myself the hum in my teeth belonged to far freight, rolling, imaginary tracks. A ribbon of violet unspooled straight overhead like a string being pulled through fabric. The low sound thickened into a feeling in the ribs. When I said my name aloud as a joke, the light brightened, the way a cat lifts its head when it opens. At 1:47, the time-lapse missed a frame. The camera woke for a shot and did not fire, as if it had heard a better idea. I lifted it from the tripod and felt that low resonance running in the body like a purr. The frost ring widened another hair, even with the camera under my coat. A second camera showed the same blinking scar, not in the same place, but matched beat for beat. I turned my face to the wind, so I would stop looking at screens long enough to remember Alaska can count. In the sound, the whisper stitched my name together again, almost right. I tested the compass because I like rituals. The needle spun a quarter turn, then settled on north like a child told to sit. The sky arched a green lid over me, and the forest closed into a hush that was not friendly. I had told myself I was alone, so the story would be simple. Simple stories profit. Complicated ones demand favors. The hum thickened until it found the tripod and taught it to tremble, as if a note had taught a tuning fork its name. I put a hand on the leg to steady it and felt the tremor bend under my fingers like muscle. One of the things you learn about northern lights is that human eyes are poor witnesses. Cameras see more. They cheat night by adding it all up. My instinct was to keep taking, to hoard color and movement like food. That was the trap. I asked the sky for another minute. The clock said 2:05. The wind said my name in my voice, slightly off, as if it had learned from a recording where my laugh used to be. I took a test frame at a higher ISO to catch whatever hid in the dim. The blink scar widened. It stopped being metaphor and looked back. I shut the camera off, sensible and late. The frost on the glass curled at the edges like eyelashes meeting steam and then refusing to melt. In the snow behind my tripod, my boot prints behaved. They bit deep. The shadow they threw did not. It flowed away from the Aurora as if afraid. Light does that to shadows, you will say. Not like this. The shadow bent up slope, away from the brightest arc, like iron filings retreating from a magnet. The hum found a subharmonic and sang it through my molars. I spoke my name again. A second later, the lights repeated it without mouth. The red herring arrived in a neat coat. Satellites sometimes flare. Aircraft sometimes drag their lights low. There are stable auroral arcs with names that make you feel like a child saying them. There are pulsing auroras that dance in imagined circles. I have watched whole nights of science. I trusted with my taxes. I wanted to be wrong in a respectable way. I aimed the long lens at the brightest knot and held my breath the way they tell you to on those calm breathing apps. The knot narrowed. Inside it, the green weakened and a dark center gathered, deliberate and shy. At 2:09, the wind died. There was only the hum. Filling the space, wind had vacated like a lover who pays rent on an empty room. The camera in my hands buzzed. The compass learned a new party trick and spun. Not fast, not childish. Slow and patient hunting. When it found a direction, it did not stop on north. The needle rose. It lifted not much, but enough to separate from the bed like a hand learning to wave. I laughed because terror and comedy are cousins, and because the sound kept my teeth from ringing out a name I did not want to hear again. Here's where the clock grew claws. 2:10. 3 minutes until Jay's sermon came due. I could pack the cards and run to the truck. I could destroy the work and save my eyes other colors. I could stay and film something no sponsor could buy, no award could ignore. Livelihood is a tender word until you hold it against weather. My reputation had been expensive to build and felt fragile as the frost mouth on the lens. I picture the comments. Pareidolia. Fake. Creepypasta. Then I pictured a hand-sized circle of ice forming where my pupil should be. I'm not brave. I am practical. The hum grew teeth. The snow under my boots learned a small vibration, like a low subway coming, then passing, then returning. My shadow lifted at the edges, not up but away, as if tempted to separate from me and go stand with the trees. The camera screen flashed a message I had never seen in its life. Identifying. It stayed there blinking, as if the sky had plugged a cable into my gear to see where to send the invoice. The frost ring on the glass closed another notch and showed a darker center I refused to call by any familiar name. It felt like a pupil choosing. I did the stupid thing first. I kept shooting. 3 frames. 4. A tone folded into the hum. A higher whine I felt in the bones of my cheeks. The Aurora above nodded like cloth twisted around a knot and then let go. It turned its long body and the arcs aligned like concentric circles viewed from the inside. Purple bit the edges. Green grew pale where it used to riot. The dark center gathered and learned how to be a circle. In my ear, the wind told me to look again at the compass. The needle had left its home point and was pointing up. 2:12. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a soft panic. Auto upload connected. Signal found. Files moving. If you have ever felt watched by a machine you taught to do it, you know the dread that came. The sky lowered. No physical motion, just a change in how close it felt, as if distance were a manner rather than a measure. My name arrived again, in my voice, in a tone no friend would ever use. It had the careful cadence of someone reading off a list and checking boxes. Battery 1 died. Battery 2 followed. The hum stepped into my chest like a thought I did not choose. 2 choices then. Keep filming and let whatever listened finish its catalog. Or destroy the camera that had taken me to glaciers, to weddings, to my mother's kitchen where steam looked good at sunrise. The first choice promised proof and attention and a kind of respect I had begged for with a decade of early mornings. The second choice promised fewer colors but more sleep. I have never liked flames, but I like the sound of glass breaking into a future I can live with. I laid the camera down on the snow, so clean it looked like a table. I raised the tripod leg. 2:13, the sky opened. That is the verb I will use, and I invite your theories to argue with it. The green thinned to a glass skin. The purple bled to the edges like a bruise. Inside the circle a hole formed, not black, not lightless, but a depth that made my knees consider new careers. A focus. The hum went silent in the way rooms go silent when people hold their breath. The compass needle stood at attention with one end kissing the inside of the dome of glass. My shadow stepped away from me in a polite, apologetic motion, then froze as if it had been caught. The circle looked at me. There is no poetry here. It chose the things it needed to make my shape a file. Height. Heat. The beat of my blood against my gum where I had bitten it last winter and never got it looked at. It tasted what kind of fear I am good at. The identifying message on the camera flashed to a full word with a blank next to it. Waiting. My shoulder cramped from holding the tripod like a mallet, and I brought it down hard on the camera's face. The screen gave a small puff of pixels. The frost ring shattered like a tooth meeting ice water. Everything dropped a tone. The Aurora rippled in offense and folded back into its curtain close. The compass needle slapped down into its coward's bed. My shadow came running back to me and arrived wrong, a half inch to the left, where it stayed for a long breath. The hum left my teeth, and the old night noises returned like co-workers creeping back into a meeting they had walked out of. I stood shivering, not from weather, but from a feeling of being skipped in a deck of cards. It had been dealing. I had folded. That was not the end. Immediate relief is a liar. My hand stung. The camera looked unimportant in pieces. I packed the other bodies without looking at the last frames because I knew I would bargain if I did. The trail back to the truck was a tunnel of trees with snow hung on their arms like fur. The hum found me once a small throat clearing. They decided I was not on its shift anymore. I drove too fast down a road built to punish that habit. In the rear view, the sky stayed calm and green like an apology. The compass rode the dash, with its needle behaving like a saint. 3 days later, the echo arrived. My phone lit at 2:13 in the afternoon. Wrong time, wrong light, wrong courage. New comment on your upload, it said, and I did not remember giving anyone a thing. The folder showed a file I had never named. The thumbnail was an eye of light with a pupil of dark, and in the reflective curve of its rim there I was tiny and exact, mouth open in a shape that could be prayer or very slow cursing. The metadata said it had uploaded at 2:13 that night, just before glass met aluminum. The signal had whispered while the hum taught my bones. I sent it to my sponsor, and he replied with an emoji that looked like a shrug, and then the word wild. The comments came like tidy knives. Hoax. Mask. Drone. The nice one said art. The mean one said liar. That is the weather you get when you bring home something that does not fit in shelves. I thought about deleting it. Then I thought about the thing that now had my face in its archive. Maybe I want proof if it ever asks for me by last name, the way a librarian calls you to the desk when a book you did not request arrives for you anyway. At night, in cities, I noticed my shadow favoring the wrong direction under streetlights when I came around corners alone. Not always, just sometimes, as if a small part of me still belonged to a light that does not live here. The frost on my apartment window learned to form in circles when I breathed on it, tiny rings that refused to melt until I looked away. The low hum came back under certain frequencies. Refrigerators, airplanes, a train braking a mile away. All of them carried a flavor of that note, as if the world had been tuned and had not quite untuned. I went back to the bait shop because I wanted Jay to tell me I had imagined it the wrong way, like a decent neighbor. He looked at the uploaded photo on my phone without touching it, as if fingerprints could travel through. If you stare long enough at a thing that stares back, it knows the measurement of you, he said, which sounded like recycled wisdom until he added, the full ones keep a list. He tapped the cheap compass I had pocketed without thinking. The needle rose a hair and then decided not to show off. He smiled like the weather had done him a favor. I have refused several offers to sell the negative, which I do not technically possess because the camera that made it died and the file refuses to be copied without the colors breaking into a mess nobody believes. When my email pings at 2:13, which it does more often than chance would make kind, I put my phone in the freezer because I am childish and magic is no more offended by that than by Latin. The file still opens, even from behind cold glass. It always shows that rim. In the curve of it, I'm always the same size, as if distance and time are not variables it respects. If you ever go north for light, bring batteries and kindness and some silence you can spend without going broke. If your lens frosts from the inside, take that as a sign that something is learning your outline and would like a better copy. If the colors bend where they should flow, remember that circles make good traps. If you hear your name in a voice that almost gets you right, almost is not a favor. It is a test. And if a compass starts to rise like a finger pointing up, you can pack your things slowly. It has already seen enough. I still shoot. The work is fine in daylight. At night, I put my cameras in the closet, and sometimes the hum leaks through the door like a neighbor practicing cello without talent. Friends ask when I will chase the Aurora again. I tell them I am waiting for a forecast that predicts none. When the sky is black and empty, I will go stand under it and think about circles. I will think about being measured. I will think about a list that knows my name but not my laugh. Then I will take a picture of darkness and see if it uploads itself while I sleep. One last thing. A month after the ridge, I woke at 2:13 with my room full of a soft green that had no source. It felt like the glow you get from leaving a TV paused on a scene too long. The compass on my nightstand was working hard to stay humble. The frost on the window learned its favorite trick and formed a circle the size of my palm, not melting as my breath clouded. In the circle, for a heartbeat or two, there was a depth that did not belong to glass. It noticed my eyes already open. It closed like a hand letting go of a glass marble. I keep the cheap compass on my desk now. If the needle ever points up more than a hair, I will go for a walk and leave my phone at home. If a photo appears in the cloud after that, it will not have my hands in it. I tell myself this is how you live with an attention you did not want. You refuse to give the rest of you. If you do find my name mispronounced by wind someday, do me a favor and pretend you did not hear. That is the kind of mercy the sky does not know how to offer yet. Story 4. The cabin that changed its mind. Now we move to the 4th story. Some cabins shelter you, but this one wanted to go somewhere with me inside. I heard it the first night, a groan from the timbers like someone turning over in sleep, long and wet as if the wood had lungs. My lantern threw a small orange circle, and the flame shrank whenever I lifted it, as if the room were sipping it through a straw. If you have ever stayed alone in the bush in a building older than your stories, you know the way the dark leans in to negotiate. I told the room I would pay in quiet. The room negotiated in drafts. I was the winter caretaker for a remote research cabin an hour off the road by snow machine. Keep the roof clear, keep the stove fed, keep the radio check at dawn. The paycheck would rescue my truck from repossession and, if I was lucky, buy a plane ticket to see my sister after 2 years of sorry excuses. A storm was due at midnight, and the ranger station had warned me not to sleep deep. The job was to stay. The floor, however, felt like it had other plans. It sat under my feet like a boat that had loosened its rope. Morning showed me the first list of small wrongs. The kitchen floor pitched half a degree to the east when I knew it pitched west. The window above the sink framed a spruce that had always been to the right of the snag, not to the left. Scratches had appeared in the doorframe at about hip height, for ragged grooves, as if some curious animal had asked to be let in and changed its mind. A map pinned above the desk showed the cabin in pencil circles in 3 different places, each with dates in different handwriting. The lantern burned down too fast to be fair. I chalked the floor pitch up to frost heave and told myself permafrost has moods, same as people. I told myself a hungry black bear had come testing for anything that smelled like bacon grease and written its complaint in the trim. When I tried to line the table leg with a hairline crack in the plank I had memorized last season, the crack had moved a 1/4 inch left. Outside, my tracks from yesterday did not meet the door. A draft came and went from the west wall in a rhythm that did not match the wind. The cabin breathed on its own time, as if listening. By dusk, the windows had turned fussy. The east window showed the moon higher than the almanac promised. The north window showed the line of spruce too close. Trunks thickened like they had stepped forward while I was looking elsewhere. The lantern flame thinned when I stood near the west wall and recovered by the stove, which is the opposite of how heat should treat light. Each time I moved the lantern, the timbers groaned like a sleeper adjusting, grateful for a better pillow. I laughed, so I wouldn't apologize to a house, then apologized anyway, because manners matter when you have so few witnesses. The first lurch came with so little ceremony, I thought I had imagined it. A tin mug slid 2 inches across the table. The floor mumbled under my boots like an old dog dreaming. The radio hissed and cleared, then hissed again. I stepped to the door and found the scratches deeper by a sliver, fresh wood pale against weathered grain. I knelt and touched them and felt heat in the cuts, not from friction, but from something that had held on. Outside, the snow around the skids of the cabin was smooth and perfect. No prints, no disturbance, as if the world had been ironed. I found a note under the map in a tidy hand. Winter of 2002, moved 2 lengths, seen from inside only. Oil use doubled. Do not let lantern burn near west wall. It was the sort of note you leave yourself in a kitchen when you learn the stove runs hot, except this one spoke like a recipe for a place that cooked itself. I took the map down. The second set of circles showed the cabin 100 yards north 1 year, then a quarter mile east the next, then back like a regret. A pencil line connected them like a migration path, complete with little arrows. That night the storm laid its hand on the roof and pushed. The timbers answered with groans that rose and fell like words I almost understood. Every time the lantern flame thinned, a draft picked up, as if the room were telling me where to point my attention. I moved the lantern to the table, and the flame stood tall until I walked away. When I set it near the door frame, the wick burned faster and a thin curl of black traced up the glass. The scratches looked deeper. I pictured claws. I pictured a bored person with a knife. Neither picture fit the heat I felt. At 1 in the morning, the floor sloped harder and did not slope back. The mug took a slow walk to the edge and tipped and did not break, which felt like a kindness and a warning. I opened the door and found wind like a wall, the kind you push your face into and come away with tears you didn't earn. The cabin skid sat half buried in drift, but the snow against the west side had a faint trough, like something had leaned down and pulled. When I shut the door, the latch met the strike plate wrong by a coin's width, though I had not touched the hinges. The lantern died early. I could have sworn I had poured enough oil for 6 hours. For in, the flame narrowed to a blonde hair and shook in a draft where there should have been no seam. I took it to the stove to refill and watched the flame grow fatter, happier near heat like a cat on a radiator. When I carried it back toward the west wall, it bowed and hissed, the way a match bows when someone draws breath to blow it out. The timbers groaned in response, a long note of pleasure or pain. You learn to hear both the same way. Radio check at dawn is a promise. I slept in clothes and set my alarm. I woke to the room uncannily still, the hush that comes when a fight has resolved but you do not know who won. The doorframe scratches had deepened again, now with the faintest suggestion of a rounded end, like the tip of a finger had pressed and dragged. The floor pitched 1.5 degrees. The window above the sink framed a view of river ice I knew to live a quarter mile away. The lantern glass had a soot tongue on the side that had faced the west wall, as if licked. I called the ranger station, and the radio gave me a blank channel you have to pretend is company. I gave my name and coordinates and heard what sounded like my name played back from down hallway. I blamed weather, because blaming weather is ergonomic. I put on boots and shouldered the door open. The storm had passed on with professional detachment. The world was smug in its quiet. The cabin sat on its skids where it always had, but the snow beside the west wall bore 4 long grooves where the drift had been pressed inward and then released. Handles. That was the word my mind offered, unwelcome and exact. The red herring arrived in a flannel shirt and my father's voice in my head. He had taught me to fear earthquakes the way other dads teach jump shots. Frosty Eve, I said out loud. Subsidence. Creep. Words with syllables to make fear feel like school. I wedged shims under table legs and wrote a note on the map to mark where the window view had changed. Noon found me pacing the perimeter with a lantern in hand because the electric lights dimmed in a way that made me think of a person pretending to be asleep. Every time flame met westwood, it thinned like blood. Over the next day, the cabin learned new tricks. The pantry door, which always stuck, now opened like a politeness, and the back closet refused to be found. It had not vanished. It had moved. I swore I had hung my parka behind the stove, and there was in a hall that had not been a hall yesterday, a hall that ran too long for the known footprint. I measured the boards with my palm, plank by plank, and ended with an extra step that had no place to live. The timbers groaned again, this time with a rhythm like a person finding their footing after a long sit. I set a can of coffee on the floor and drew a pencil line around it. When the cabin sighed, the can drifted, slow and stubborn, to the edge of my circle and rested there like a dog whose bed is wrong by inches. I tried to square the windows with the map. The distances did not negotiate. The river hung closer in the frame than it had the day before, though the walkout still took the same time. What I saw through the glass and what my feet learned were two different prophecies. The cabin was practicing belief. It chose the promise that got it moving. Night 2, the lantern drank a full reservoir by midnight and wanted more at 2. The wick looked chewed. I touched the doorframe grooves again and found them deeper, smooth to the finger, like skin polished by a long habit. I held the lantern close and watched the flame lean toward the cuts, not away from drafts, toward them, like a green plant toward sun. It bowed as if something on the other side were drinking what it needed through a straw stuck in between. When I pulled the lantern back, the flame recovered with a fat sigh. The wood in the frame relaxed with a tiny, grateful squeak. I did a cruel test because curiosity is a kind of cruelty with paperwork. I took the lantern to each wall and watched. East, the flame tightened but held. North, it wavered. South, it sulked and recovered. West, it starved. The timbers gave their long voice, and the floor shivered, short and embarrassed, like a person whose stomach had announced itself in public. The red herring about bears died in the hallway when I found fresh scratch marks inside the frame, not outside. Handles, I thought again, but not for hands. For a grip that did not need fingers. For a house that took itself by the door and pulled. I called the station on the hour. The radio gave me static and then a single syllable that could have been yes or a hinge. I ate cold beans by the sink and thought of my sister's laugh when we were kids and the way she would have told me to stop naming noises. The map on the wall crowded my thinking, those circles like stops on a bus line, only one passenger road. The pencil arrows pointed generally west, toward the river and beyond at the flats and beyond at the coast. Windows or invitations, I thought. Not for me. For it. The cabin wanted what the windows showed. Morning 3 tried to be normal. I did chores in a room that had been stretched like taffy. I shoveled a roof and came down to a kitchen that had traded places with the dining corner in the sense that it felt wrong and would not confess why. The stovepipe coughed smoke back into the room and then thought better of it and pulled hard, a breath that stole mine. The floor groaned like feet pushing against boards, testing purchase. The map's pencil line looked smug. The lantern on the table burned as if it belonged to someone else now, someone generous with fuel he did not own. I found the point of no return in a choice that looked reasonable until you looked at it from the wrong side. Step out through a window into a storm that was due back by nightfall and risk losing the cabin and the income and the radio, or stay inside and try to steer. The idea of steering a building would have made me laugh the week before. It didn't now. The lantern was a magnet. The light fed something in the wood, and the wood answered by moving, little by little, then in longer listens. If light was food, maybe I could make it chase dinner the way people use carrots on sticks. I killed the electric light and left one lantern lit. I sat on the sill of the north window, away from the river view, and watched the flame behave fat and proud. The timbers went quiet. The floor settled a hair. Good, I said like a person to a decent dog. Then I moved the lantern toward the west window that framed a sliver of pale sky over the river. The flame thinned. The door frame gave that polished squeak. The floor pitched so softly I only knew because the coffee can drifted over its pencil ring. The cabin liked the west. The cabin liked the picture of the river like a mouth like sugar. So I started. I snuffed the lantern at the west window, and the room reacted like a held breath released. Then I lit a small candle and set it on the north sill and watched the tiny flame pull a little draft and the timbers speak a low vowel, a sound like interest without commitment. The cabin eased away a finger's width, if it moved at all. When I moved the candle back to the west, it drank, boards tightening, nails creaking in gratitude. Oil level down. Wick chewed more than used. The cabin wanted to go. It wanted to go where the windows told it the world would be sweeter. At dusk, the check-in failed again. My voice went up into the radio like smoke and came down as a distorted version of yes. This is Ranger Baird. Say again, except the station manager has a higher voice and laughs in syllables, and this one rolled the words like it was tasting the shape of them. I told the room to stop listening. The room listened harder. The storm came back with a new opinion, and the cabin leaned against it the way a stubborn person leans against a friend who has decided to leave first. The lantern burned as if I had filled it yesterday. I had filled it an hour ago. Then movement turned honest. The pantry jumped closer by a foot. The hall shortened and grew again like an accordion finding a key. The west window lifted half an inch as if a shoulder had shrugged beneath it. The floor pushed the coffee can out of its circle, slow as truth. I opened the door and wind shouldered me like a rude cousin. The snow were slick and groomed to a sheen, as if something heavy had passed over and ironed it with a hot plate. Beneath the skids, the troughs were deeper, cleaner. Handles, again, not scratched at, pressed and used. The cabin had taken itself by its own throat and pulled. I stood with the door open, letting in cold I could not afford, and watched the lantern flame lean toward the frame like a child toward candy. I thought of the map's circles and the pencil arrows drawn by different hands across different winters, all pointing toward the flats, the sea beyond, the place where the world opens and says choose. If the cabin finished its move while I was inside, would the radio coordinates still match my life? Would anyone find me? Would my sister hear about a caretaker who vanished but left his coffee warming? And would she forgive me for the way I had failed to leave before? I made my ruinous decision with a kindness in mind. I would steer it back toward the Safewood Trail and hold it there with small light, the way you hold a nervous animal with a hand on its shoulder, steady and without surprise. I lit a second lantern and set both on the north sill, far from the river view. The timbers moaned in protest, and the floor went still, like a muscle waiting for a better command. The door frame did not squeak. For a long minute, nothing moved. Then the west window brightened slightly, as if the outside had heard about the feast and come to the door to ask. The clock gave me teeth again. Dawn check-in in an hour. If I missed it a third time, they would worry and send someone. If the cabin kept walking, they would drive a snow machine to coordinates where nothing stood but 4 shallow troughs like fingerprints in snow. I took one lantern from the north sill and, with hands I did not trust, raised it high in the center of the room. The flame thin, pinched. The timbers sang low and rolled into a higher pitch like birds arguing over what the sky was doing. The floor creaked in question. West asked the house. West asked the windows. I did not answer. I took the lantern and walked into the hall that had been too long yesterday and was proper again today. I set the flame before the pantry door. The boards tightened, interested. I moved it to the closet that liked to go missing. The hinges sighed in relief, a sound like a joint sliding back into socket. Then I opened the closet and found a window that had not existed in this wall, set high and narrow. It showed a sliver of spruce I did not recognize and the collapsed roof of a building that should have been 10 miles away. The cabin had made itself a wish. If light was food and windows were goals, then I had to trick a hungry thing into wanting a different meal. I cut my last candle into 5 coins with my pocket knife and lit them with shaking fingers. I placed them in a line on the floor from the north wall to the center of the room, little stars on a dark map. The timbers groaned like a chuckle, and the floor took a small, honest step. The coffee can slid a little. The doorframe hummed like a throat. The lantern in my hand burned shorter, faster. Oil gone where oil should not have been gone. The house ate the light and learned. I carried the biggest lantern to the far corner where the old storm window leaned covered in dust. I cleaned its glass with my sleeve until it showed me a view of the trailhead I knew if I squinted and believed. The flame bowed to it, hungry for the picture of safety. The timbers gave a long, grateful note, and the floor leaned with purpose, slow and dignified like a heavy person rising without using arms. The cabin moved. Not far, but far enough to call it moving, and far enough to know the direction was mine for a moment. I had the leash, and the leash had me. The radio crackled with insultingly cheerful weather notes from a place that did not exist in my coordinates. I gave my call sign again, and the answer came thin and delayed, as if the room were repeating me back to myself for practice. In the west window, the river had widened and the ice showed long, black tongues where overflow had licked. The house like the window that promised open ground, easy sliding, a clean pull. It hated the picture of the tight trail between thick spruce, labor, and corners. I gave it the lantern towards spruce anyway and started west. It made the sound a dog makes when you deny the door. The last oil hissed and died and the light went out. Everything paused. The house did not punish me. It waited. Then, because I'm more stubborn than wise, I opened the lantern and scraped the soot with a stick and found a smear of oil clinging like regret. I lit it and the flame caught, thin as a throat clearing. The timber side and the floor took another small step toward the north picture. The doorframe gave a quiet groove, a new polish. The closet window showed the spruce sliver moved by a whisper. I had stolen inches from a thing that could do feet, perhaps miles. It was not pleased. The storm arrived like a debt collector. The roof rattled. The stove popped. Smoke dragged low, then ran up the pipe like an animal saved at the last second. The house leaned west in one long yearning, then remembered I had given it its supper at the north wall and shivered back an inch, as if embarrassed. My check-in window ticked to 0, and I said my name in a static that loved me in a cold way. The house answered with a long groan that began in the floor and ended in the frame, a note I could not translate except to say it held my name inside it like a seed. I will not lie. I got scared in a way that makes your hands do embarrassing things. I picked up the biggest lantern and, without asking permission, threw it out the north window. The glass burst with a tidy resignation, and the flame's cold light tumbled into snow and skittered under the sill. The house lunged. The floor shoved. The doorframe screamed. The entire structure took a greedy, undeniable step in the direction of the fallen light. And with that movement, I understood the map fully. They had fed it light in different winters, and it had gone to where the brightest picture promised release. It was not haunted. It was hungry and migratory. The leap it took to follow my throne lamp put the floor at a new pitch that smashed the coffee can into the wall with a dull punch. The hall slid back to long and small. The closet window lost its spruce and framed blank white, then a smear of black like a distant ridge I had never climbed. The west window showed less river, more flats, as if I had pulled us off that path by inches. I felt the immediate consequence in my knees and the delayed echo waiting in my spine. The house could not be stopped, only starved, and I had shown it I could feed it with a gesture. I cut the candle stubs into even smaller circles and threw them one by one toward the north view like breadcrumbs. The house followed in slow, offended lurches. Each toss cost me breath and clarity and the feeling I would have fingers in the morning. With each move, the lantern glass inside grew cleaner, the soot licked away by a draft that did not belong to weather. The doorframe grooves grew smooth as a well-used handrail. The map on the wall tore and fell, exposing older notes beneath, older arrows, older coordinates. Someone had tried this and written, "Please do not leave lights by west windows," underlined twice. Dawn showed itself in the way shadows learn edges. The storm tired of being cruel. The radio found a human voice that sounded like the station manager and then like a stranger wearing his words. I told him I was here. I gave the old coordinates and a set of new ones I guessed by the ridge line the closet window had briefly shown. They repeated them back in a tone that promised a machine would try to care. The house made a small, grudging noise and settled one more inch toward the safe picture I had made for it, and then went still, the way a sleeper pretends for the benefit of others. I did not wait for the snow machine. I pulled on my parka and opened the door. It had moved a finger's width closer to the jamb, polished like bone, warm to the touch. Outside, The snow showed 4 deep troughs along the west wall where the cabin had gripped and pulled itself like a seal across ice. There were no footprints, not mine. The skid stood on ground that had not been ground yesterday. A stump I knew by heart had relocated to the far window frame. The world had allowed a lie and then tidied around it, so no one would be inconvenienced by the truth. I left a note on the table in my neatest, most apologetic hand. Door already open. If you come, bring no lanterns. Leave electric in the sled. Feed the dark. I took the radio, the dry matches, the cheap tea, and the small map with pencil tears and went out the north side through the broken window, each step an argument with a drift that wanted me to stay. Behind me, the timbers made a small patient sound like a throat deciding whether to clear. I did not look back. You should not watch someone you have forced to change their mind in public. They found the cabin, of course. Not that day. Not where I left my note. The search party's report said it stood at the edge of a small frozen slough 3 miles off its old site. Door wide, stove cold, lantern glass clean as a confession. The map on the wall had rearranged itself on the floor. Circles rubbed through like coins passed hand to hand. The scratches on the door frame had grown shiny as if in gratitude. One ranger swears he heard the timbers sigh when he walked in with a headlamp and that his lamp dimmed until he took it off and left it on the stoop. I am telling you this, long past the date my contract ended, from a rented room in town where the walls are drywall and the neighbors argue about ordinary things. The heater hums the right way. The lights keep their size. Yet some nights, when I wake at the hour the cabin liked to consider its options, my door frame shows 4 pale grooves where there should be painted smoothness, and a draft arrives from the side of the room that has no window. It tastes like sap and snow and wet nails. It tastes like motion choosing. I set my phone screen face down. I did not bring candles home. If you visit the site by daylight, you will see 4 troughs along the west and the faintest suggestion of a path toward the north, then turning away, then back again, like a creature deciding it does not owe you simplicity. The ranger report ends tidy. Coordinates, photos, recommendation to decommission the cabin in spring. They will haul it out in pieces if they can, unless the pieces decide to remember themselves and come back together with the first warm wind. Unless the dark under someone else's door becomes hungry at the thought of being fed. Unless a window shows a place it would rather be and makes you agree. Which story creeped you out the most so far? Tell me in the comments so I know where to take you next. Story 5. Numbers under the sea ice. Now, we move to the last story for tonight. The sea ice doesn't just crack. It counts, and on my 5th week at the camp, I realized it had started counting me. I was a data tech with a shaky contract and an even shakier furnace back home, pulling midnight shifts on a research project that wanted precision more than romance. The wind sawed along the shelter seams, and my breath fogged in bursts that looked like someone else timing them for me. I told myself it was the cold playing clerk. The first number showed up anyway, waiting under the ice like a clock without hands. The first odd detail wasn't dramatic. It was tidy. A faint 1 appeared under the clear skim near hole C, shaped by tiny air bubbles trapped in a seam. Drillers love patterns. We also distrust them on principle. I logged it, blamed stress fractures, and pulled my hood tight until my ears stopped ringing. When I tapped the surface with the aluminum rod to test thickness, the echo returned once, then again, then a 3rd time softer, the way a hallway pays you back in portions. I told the recorder my name, date, and temperature. The echo added my syllables back like a teacher correcting a child. The stopwatch on my parka zipper was my best friend. 30 seconds on, 30 off, the rhythm of a person who wants to look competent in grant reports. That night it hiccuped. It slid from 0:27 to 0:25 without passing through 26, like it had skipped a breath. I clicked it against my palm. The numbers blinked, patient and wrong. Behind me, the pressure ridges boomed like someone rolling a metal drum under miles of quilt. Midnight was hours away. The booms usually grew louder near 12, then eased back like a church settling after hymns. This one arrived early and then hid, curious and shy. You could stand over the holes and see the dark heave beneath like a sleeping bag. I kept a respectful distance. A research lead named Maya had once said, "Never assume the ocean agrees with our categories," which sounds wise until you need the categories to put food in a bowl. That second night with the one, a second shape formed under hole A. Not a clean number, a suggestion. Two parallel tracks with a curve at top, like a tube practicing in kindergarten. The ice made its own handwriting. When I touched the auger handle to start cleaning slush, I found a new scratch along the grip that matched the curve. I wanted to say the scratch had always been there, but the handle was mine, and I cleaned my tools like a ritual. The mark was fresh, frost-white, and shallow enough to feel like a draft across skin. I blew on it, a stupid instinct, and watched my breath cloud in neat puffs that looked suspiciously like a metronome. For clouds, a pause. For clouds, a pause. The stopwatch skipped 26 again. Pressure boomed far out with a patient regularity. I called Maya on the radio with my gloves off because accuracy likes fingers. Static answered in a hungry way, and then my name repeated back to me wrong. You know the way your name sounds on a bad connection? Flattened and clipped like the other person can't quite fit in their mouth. I laughed into the mic because fear despises witnesses. Copy that. Camp, the static said a beat late, voice thin as aluminum. Then it added my last name, as if reading it off a file it didn't respect. I looked down a hole C. The one had blurred, which should have calmed me. It didn't. The blur looked like a hand wiping chalk, and beneath the smear a faint 2 gathered itself with a patience that made my molars hurt. By the third night, the stopwatch had a personality. It kept honest time until I stepped onto the ice. Then it learned shortcuts. 29, 27, 24, the numbers collapsing as if distance mattered less than attention. The echo test grew worse. I tapped the surface and the sound returned, waited, then returned again from farther left, then from directly under my boots, softer and closer. Not the lake talking. The thing under the lake reusing my sound. When I pulled up the auger from hole B, the spiral fluted with a clean ribbon of ice tattooed by hair-thin grooves in neat columns. I wiped the grooves with a bare thumb until it burned. The columns were numbers written in a script that made more sense by feel than sight. They weren't mine, and they weren't random. They matched the faint shapes under the ice at each hole, as if someone had used my tool like a stylus press between two panes of glass. The booms came at cleaner intervals that night, spaced like a slow second hand. Maya arrived with a thermos and her tired smile, and the wind made conversation a negotiation. "Hear that?" she said, not a question. I tapped the ice again. The third echo answered like a person who'd been waiting to be included. We are taught to mistrust the romantic interpretation. Data, or it didn't happen. I wrote in the log. Anomalous acoustic persistence, possible ducting across pressure layers. That is a sentence a Grant likes to see. I did not write. My own knock returned from under my boots in a smaller voice and counted my breaths. Maya knelt, her breath fogged in bursts that seemed to sync with mine. When she held her stopwatch next to mine, both skipped 26 together, obedient to something that didn't need our cooperation. She exhaled a single, careful laugh. "We're measuring standing waves," she said to the air. The air did not care for reassurance. At 11:58, the cracks started talking in nouns. The ridges yawned in measured beats, for booms, pause, each the length of a hell breath. We both looked at our watches. The hands agreed on nearly midnight. The digital readouts disagreed on the seconds like siblings who won't sit together in the car. An old rule says never stand over a hole at 12. We followed it, mostly out of the kind of superstition that grows legs when your life depends on a surface that can pretend to be solid and then become opinionated. Across the dark, something shifted with a decisiveness that felt like a choice. I love machines because they are honest when they fail. The camp generator hiccuped once in the distance and returned, ashamed. The floodlight over the sled faded a fraction and then recovered like a man who stumbles and insists he was merely bowing. Under the ice, the faint 2 became clean, then tallied itself with a tiny line through its middle as if to forbid arguments. Whole, it began a long, low exhale I could feel through my boots. The echo test returned quickly, and then once again many lengths away, exactly 1. Exactly 2, as if the ice had learned to count in a language we share but don't own. Maya squeezed my arm without looking at me. "It'll pass," she said, which is what people say about weather and grief and bad jobs that pay for the good ones. At precisely midnight, by the clock that skipped, the pressure boomed so cleanly you could have set a metronome to it. From the far flats, a hollow answer returned, slower, like a bass note responding to a snare. The skin under my parka prickled in neat rows, as if being cataloged. I lifted my glove and found new scratches on the auger handle where my palm would rest. Not gouges, curves and bars. Additions to a list, polite and efficient. The red herring arrived on time, in fleece and familiarity. A visiting physicist named Novak had given a lunchtime talk about ice lenses and flexural waves. "Taps repeat because the sheet is a drum," he said, slicing the air with a fork. "Your brain hears will, and you call it a ghost." He wasn't wrong. He wasn't right enough. After his talk, he borrowed my stopwatch and clicked it with theatrical skepticism. It skipped 26 for him too. Battery, he decided. I didn't argue. Batteries were a prettier enemy. The next shift, at hole D, the numbers under the ice reached 3. The auger handle learned a third line to match. Choice pretends to be generous. It isn't. At dinner, Maya told me the regional coordinator wanted a full midnight series, clean taps at every hole, with recorders running. "We're close," she said, which is a thing people say with reverence when they smell a paper or a promotion. She didn't say the other part out loud. If we stayed, we could secure a data set that would fund a winter. If we left, we would protect skin and name and breath from being added to anything that counts living things. The stakes tasted like metal. The stopwatch ticked wrong between us, practicing inconvenient honesty. We chose to stay because stories about people who choose to leave don't get told at meetings. I set up the mics with colder hands and I admitted. We synced time across devices, and the devices introduced their various small treacheries with professional smiles. I stood over hole B, rod ready. Maya stood 10 meters off with the parabolic dish aimed like a prayer. The wind respected our ceremony for 1 minute. Then it leaned in to ask questions and did not wait for answers. At 11:59, the booms steadied into exact intervals. So exact I couldn't help imagining a mouth counting with lips I wasn't allowed to see. I tapped. 1. The echo returned in 2 beats, softer, then in 3, softer still, then in 4, like a friend at the end of a long hallway stepping closer. I tapped again. The second echo matched, but the third came faster than it should, as if it had gotten excited or bored. I couldn't tell which. My breath fogged in 4s, and I tried to break the rhythm and could not. It was easier to obey than to invent. The stopwatch skipped 26 and then 19, more brazen now that we were paying attention. Maya's voice on the radio came steady. "Keep the series. Whatever it is, it's consistent." At midnight, exactly by the camp's big clock, the faint 3 beneath hole D thickened to a 4, and the figure under hole became a hand-done 5, slanted, human wrong. I don't mean it looked written by a person. I mean it looked written as a copy of something a person would write, like a child practicing the way we make ourselves legible. A long pressure moan rolled under us, not a crack so much as a moving throat. I tapped again. This time the echo returned not in shrinking volume, but in equal strength, the way a person would answer you if they wanted to demonstrate listening. The ice began to thin at the edges of the numbers. You could see it by the way the bubbles moved close to the surface, impatient. I tested with the rod and got good thickness everywhere except where the numerals lay like fossils. There the rod found an elasticity I didn't like, a give that came back slow. When I lifted the auger for a final clean, the flutes wore a new line of scratches that completed a tidy 5. I told myself I'd done it absent-mindedly and hid the handle from myself. Maya announced over the radio that the recorder showed a latency we couldn't explain. The sound kept arriving after it should have died. You want the revelation to be kind. It isn't. On the 4th night, the numbers across the holes matched a pattern that made more human sense than physics. 1 through 6 glowed, faintly under 6 openings, a private little countdown without 0. When I breathed near hole C, the frost of my breath feathered into 6 soft bursts, and then stopped, as if some alternating current sucked my heat away at that interval. The stopwatch skipped not just 26, but entire spans, arriving where it wanted like a train that no longer respected the map. The booms under the sheet established a grid so regular you could have built a town on it. Maya said the thing you say when the world is showing you jokes you don't understand. "We should pack," she whispered, not into the radio this time, but to my shoulder, like a sibling telling you a secret at church. The coordinator on the sat phone objected with polite menace. Funding, milestones, career, words we had chosen as talismans, now suddenly heavy. The choice was no longer neat. Leave and risk losing the winter. Stay and risk becoming a number under the ice. The horizon wore a bruise the color of blue steel. Midnight would arrive petulant and punctual. The ice made that low, happy sound sheet metal makes when it remembers being, or we compromised with cowardice and caution. We would complete one last midnight series, then pull gear and run the sleds while the path still believed in us. That promise has a smell, ozone and panic. I checked the holes. The numbers had clarified into crisp shapes, not shadows. The lines didn't appear to be surface scratches. They were suspended just under the glaze, like ink injected between pages. At hole A, where the 6 now lived, the ice pulsed faintly as if breath belonged in water and had declared preference. I tapped once without meaning to. The echo arrived at equal volume from under my soles, and I couldn't tell if I'd made it or her at first. At 11:58, the generator in camp popped and steadied. The floodlight near the sled went dim, then brightened with an obedient whine. Maya's recorder showed a delay growing by the second, the world's laziest ghost drifting behind our time. She swore, softly and with such professionalism it felt like love. I lifted the rod. The stopwatch leapt forward by 5 seconds and held there, daring me to object. I tapped. 1, 2, 3, 4. The echoes stacked perfectly, each as loud as the last, as if many identical rooms had been placed beneath me, each containing my knock, each practicing in sync. The moment that turned choice into trap arrived quiet and ordinary. A hairline crack slid between my boots and stopped at the toe of Maya's left crampon. Not a failure. A line. It made the shape of a 1 for the length of a sigh, then resolved into a harmless scrim. The recorder caught a soft tone that we had not made, a pitch too low for speakers and too careful to be accident. It rose a semitone in regular steps, 6 clicks in all. I have never admired a melody less. I lifted the rod to stop tapping. The stop, too, echoed, and the echo kept going without me. When you're being counted, you feel your own borders. I became elbows and teeth and a clumsy body, choosing where to put weight. The numbers under the ice were no longer a countdown. They were a tally, which is a meaner thing. 1 through 6, not to 0, but to more, waiting for a next. We hadn't been subtracting toward an event. The ice had been adding lives to a list. "We're done," Maya said, and I heard her voice a price settling in. We stowed the dish badly, which made her wince even while running. I left the rod beside hole D like a shed opinion. The stopwatch on my zipper turned itself off. The immediate consequence of leaving was paperwork that would spit us out like gristle. The delayed echo, which I felt like a memory of future weather, was worse. As we crossed the flats toward the sled, a low boom rolled behind us in equal steps, keeping pace, not threatening yet, only reminding. Our breaths plumed in paired bursts, little numbered ghosts. My auger handle thumped my thigh with every step, the scratches on its grip aligning under my palm. The sled's floodlights sulked and then stood brave, and we loaded the bins with the speed of people who postponed saying sorry. I went back for the recorder because greed rides habit. It sat on the snow where Maya had left it, pulsing a tiny red light. As my glove closed, the pressure sheet beneath my boots flexed. Not breaking, only bowing, so slowly I had time to recognize fear as awe and vice versa. Under the glaze, the 6 sharpened and its tail curled into a 7, with the satisfaction of a pen finishing a word. I did not tap. The echo tapped anyway. 1, 2, 3, 4. It reached 7 and paused, patient, like an instructor offering a pencil I didn't want. The stopwatch, off, displayed 0:07 in its dead little window. We ran. That is the verb, simple and accurate. The sled engine coughed, pretended to die, revived. The floodlight licked the path into a good idea, and then forgot it. Behind us, the booms became steadier, closer, numbers with weight. The echo of my earlier taps returned in order, then in reverse, then in a new pattern entirely, as if it were trying out possibilities to find our size. Maya shouted my name, and it sounded like a good rope compared to the version the radio had offered. We hit the old track to the berm, and the sled fishtailed, a habit that feels like freedom until it doesn't. At the crest, I looked back, which was a sin against sense. The holes shone like small moons, and under each, a number glowed with a modesty that felt mean. At hole B, the 3 softened as if relieved of its duty. At hole A, the 7 held sharp as a tooth. The ice between the holes looked ordinary, which is its most dangerous mode. I told myself all the right words. Standing waves, acoustic trapping, pressure harmonics. Then the recorder in my lap, which I had forgotten to switch off, whispered my initials in our coordinator's voice and asked me to confirm receipt. We left the flats and cut into the windbreak of the shore ice. The booms receded, not in volume, but in interest, like a person deciding we were no longer the only entertainment. The stopwatch vibrated without moving, a trick it had never performed in a life devoted to being boring. Maya's breath found a less numbered rhythm, human and unremarkable. We didn't speak until the shelter flapped into a shape we recognized, a beast that sometimes loves you. Inside, with the door pinned and the heater making its petty stream of hot, we achieved the small ceremony of survival. We looked at each other like adults who had done something childish and been forgiven. The next morning was the kind of blue that looks brutal enough to break in your hand. We went back with the crew because science has cousins named liability and pride. The numbers under the ice had blurred into the general scribble you get when fresh snow chooses a surface to practice on before becoming crust. The auger handle scratches had faded to respectable dings. The stopwatch kept 26 as if it had never eloped. See, Novak said, pretending decades of friendship we hadn't had time to earn. Standing waves. Pareidolia. He patted the ice like a dog. The ice made a small, polite sound that nobody else seemed to hear. I sent the recorder files to the coordinator with notes that sounded brave and careful. We packed the camp because weather and decisions agree on one thing. Endpoints are cleaner when you declare them. On the last night, I did what you do when you want to be a person again. I put my name in a logbook with a time and a joke. I curled on my cot and let the heaters per-negotiate with my bones. At 0:12, not a special time, the shelter breathed deep in a way Faber doesn't, and the little battery clock on the shelf rolled itself forward to 0:13 without asking. The unresolved part arrived several days later, like an envelope you don't remember expecting. The coordinator posted the clean dataset for review. Below, the auto-generated field notes included each of our entries, with exact times and GPS stamps. There was one more line than we had written. It appeared after my last note by a handful of minutes we had spent zipping canvas and making jokes about soup. It read simply 8 in the same tidy font with coordinates that match-hole it down to the decimals. No initials, no staff code, no nickname, just a number behaving like a name. I called Maya and heard noise in the background that could have been traffic or surf. I saw it, she said quietly. We'll fix the log. Computers do that sometimes. She has a gift for convincing the air. Sure, I said, and looked at the stopwatch on my desk, which had resumed its dignified life. It lay face up blank at rest. Then, in the reflection on its tiny dead screen, something else moved. Not behind me, beneath me. A shadow like water from far ice. The color you only see on nights that own you. The screen did not turn on. It held that color the way a held breath holds everything. I keep the recorder on a shelf now, unopened. When trains roll past my apartment a mile away, their low boom arrives in neat intervals that a person could call ordinary. When I count my steps on bad days to quiet my head, sometimes the counts skip and pick themselves up later as if I had agreed to be edited without signing. I live with it. We live with lots of things we never signed for. If you go out on sea ice and you see numbers under the skin, do not tap. Do not breathe in fives. Do not teach it the shape of your count. The counting likes to learn. There's one last image I can't argue with. I printed the final log page for a binder because I'm a terrible romantic about paper. The last line still reads 8. If you angle the sheet under a window and look with stubborn, stupid love, you'll see a faint impression beneath the printed number, the sort you get when someone writes hard on the page above. It isn't a 9. It isn't a 0. It is a short stroke that looks like the beginning of a tally, the first mark in a set of 5, made by a person or a thing that believes time is better used adding than ending. Which story creeped you out the most? Tell me in the comments so I know where to take you next. If you made it this far into the dark, thank you for walking beside me tonight. From the last light in Barrow to a lantern that never had a heart, from an Aurora that notices to a cabin that won't hold still, and numbers under sea ice that like to add, Alaska gave us 5 ways to be seen when we'd rather be invisible. Which one followed you into your room? And which one is already waiting by your door? If a moment hooked you, tell me in the comments. Your story time keeps this channel alive when the lights start to listen. Tap like if you felt that chill, and subscribe so I can find you again the next time the wind gets formal. I read every comment, especially the ones that end with a question. Got a strange experience from the far north, or anywhere the map gets quiet? Send it in. I love true sounding stories that aren't real but feel real. If you want a part 2 in Alaska, say the word. If you want me to head south to deserts, bayous, or small towns that sleep with one eye open, leave a sign. The night goes where it's invited, right? Tonight's motifs return on purpose. A breath beside yours. A bell that rings with no hand. A window showing somewhere you haven't stood yet. If any of those show up after this video ends, don't panic. Just note the time, speak your name softly, and turn one light off at a time. If the last bulb seems to inhale, say good night and let it finish. To the new subscribers, welcome to Whispering Abyss. To the regulars, you already know the ritual. Sleep with your feet tucked in, keep a glass of water by the bed, and if the hallway floor answers when you step out, pretend you were never there. I'll be here next time, voice low, stories ready, lantern cupped in both hands. Until then, dream carefully. Some places like to count who visits, and some stories keep counting after you press stop. Good night.